Okay, good afternoon. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass. And I'd like to welcome to our event about conspiracy theories and the COVID-19 pandemic. This event is the first in a series of events that we are going to have in the Institute in the next 6 to 8 weeks. We're going to have talks about the pandemic, about memory, about Israel and Palestine, about the Holocaust, of course. So please check our website and our Facebook to be up to date. We are fortunate today to have with us Jamie Rowen and Ethan Zuckerman. I will present them shortly, who are going to discuss with us the conspiracy theories. When we talked about this a few weeks ago, we thought that America has one crisis, that is the pandemic. Today we know that there is another one, the crisis of racism and authoritarianism. In our institute, we see our mission to fight against bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, and all form of injustice. So we stand today with a rebellion against racism and authoritarianism, whether it is in Minneapolis or whether it is in Pennsylvania Avenue. And we know that there are conspiracy theories around this rebellion. So perhaps this will come in the discussion or in the question, but conspiracy theories are with us. We are fortunate to have today Jamie Rowen, who is an associate professor of legal studies and political science at UMass Amherst. She received a J.D. and a Ph.D. from Berkeley School of Law. Her research focuses on how law is utilized to redress mass atrocities. Her book, Searching for Truth in the Transitional Justice Movement, focuses on the emergence of transitional justice and efforts to make truth commissions in the Balkans, in Cambodia, and in the US. Ethan Zuckerman is director for the Center of Civic Media at MIT and associate professor at MIT's Media Lab. His research focuses on new media, the use of technology for international development, and the use of new media technologies by social and political activists. In September 2020, he will join UMass Amherst as associate professor of public policy, information, and communication. Jamie and Ethan will talk for about 45 minutes in a conversation, and then they will take questions. If you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat. And in the Q&A, I will present the questions and they will answer it. Jamie and Ethan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alon. Thank you, Ethan, for joining me here. Ethan and I decided we really want to make this a conversation, and so it's going to be more informal. We actually may try to stop a little early so we can take questions. And we're going to really discuss some things and give a little bit of insight based on the history of discriminatory conspiracy theories. And as the questions show, try to end with some conversations about how to address them, as difficult as that is. Now, I come to this with a particular background, and that is that I study how people make sense of mass atrocity. And that leads me to examine what leads to mass atrocity, which is often blaming particular groups of people for actions that those people didn't commit. And I also study the way we make sense of mass atrocity and how the ways that we make sense of mass atrocity can often lead to more violence. So that is what brings me to this particular interest in the topic of conspiracies. Now, what do we mean by conspiracies? Just to get us on the same page, conspiracies usually require that a specific being, often a person, or groups of people with similar characteristics are named, and that they have a clear identification, they have a clear motivation. And their motivation is to harm other people. And they have the capacity for something big to do this type of harm. So they control important resources, or they work with powerful allies, but they do so in secret, and they are not stopped. Interestingly, at this current moment, we might think that conspiracy theories are directed at those more powerful. That tends to be the common conversation we're having at this era. But really, in the past, it was less powerful. And connecting it to the Institute, we may not know that during the Black Death, an estimated 510 Jewish communities were destroyed. That is a small number compared to the Holocaust, but it is significant when we consider the population at the time. One contemporary observer noted that within 1 year, all the Jews between Cologne and Austria were burnt. Some examples of what this looked like. January 9th, 1349, the Jews in Basel were burned in a structure created solely for that purpose. The leaders of the town actually tried to save their Jews, but they couldn't in the face of the mobs, and 600 Jews, including the community's rabbi, were burned. 140 Jewish children were forcibly converted to Catholicism, and after that, Jews were banned from living in Basel for 200 years. That was retracted. In Mainz, the Jews succeeded in staving off a mob, but the counterattack came. They barricaded themselves in their homes, and more than 6,000 died when they set fire to their own homes rather than necessarily starving or surrendering. 2,000 Jews were burned alive on February 14th, 1349 in the Valentine's Day Strasbourg massacre. And what's important to know about these massacres is in Strasbourg, the plague hadn't even come to the city. So of course there's questions about why attack the Jews. Now there's a story that the Jews were resistant to the plague, that they died in lower numbers. And therefore the story was they poisoned the wells, right? Contemporary historians suggest that maybe they died in fewer numbers because they had less exposure, because they were more isolated, or they had different sanitary practices. Right? We don't know, but we do know Jews died in large numbers as well. And even when that was pointed out by Christian leaders, it didn't change the fact that these massacres continued. There was obviously a financial motivation, right? And there's infighting among the different communities about who would assume the debts to the Jews, right? This idea by some that their debts would be relieved if the Jews died. But then it turned out that the empire under Charles I took control of the debt obligations. And so that was a disappointment to those who thought that their debts would be relieved when they killed the Jews. The thing that's interesting about this particular time of discriminatory conspiracy theories during a pandemic is that historians really they try to make sense of this, showing that the slaughtering of Jews began long before the Black Death broke out in Europe. The causes of the persecution seem to be other than the plague. They were religious fears fueled by the church. There was financial profit. There was political interest. Now, as I've seen in my research on places such as Rwanda or Bosnia, when things get unstable, a group of people are easy to be othered, and then they're slaughtered. And that is often to manage the intense fear that everyone has. So when we talk about discriminatory conspiracy theories, it's important to think about one of the dilemmas is that the very existence of a minority may often constitute a conspiracy in people's mind, right? And this is a scholar named Moscovici who argues that minorities represent a challenge, a walking, talking criticism of what must be beyond all criticism, since they transgress our taboos through their differences. The minority allows itself to do things that the majority forbids to themselves, And this ability appears to be a privilege. Transgression breeds resentment. This takes us to the next phase of our discussion. Ethan.
Sure. So, Jamie, your focus is really on this question of how violence to groups of people, how these tragic events like the Black Death get processed by societies. My work in many ways is about this question of how media plays into these equations, and how the ability to make media and put it out in the world has a lot to do with historical arcs in one fashion or another. So I want to go far in the future from the Black Death. I want to go all the way up to the English Civil War. So I want to take us all the way forward to 1642. And 1642 is a very unusual year in English history. What you have is Charles I on the throne. He has done the unthinkable in marrying a Catholic, and he is trying very hard to wage war with Scotland. And because he knows that Parliament doesn't have his back for this, he actually tries to start making these decisions without Parliament support and refuses to call Parliament. And this leads to a schism, which eventually develops into the English Civil War, where you have a Parliament faction and a Royalist faction facing off between the two. And in early 1642, Charles decamps for Oxford, because that's where the Royalists are, and London becomes the territory of the parliamentarians, because of course it's where Parliament is. London is also where the presses are. And something absolutely extraordinary happens in London in 1642, which is that there are as many books printed in Britain in 1642 as there are in 165 years leading up to that. So the entirety of time that there are printing presses in Britain, there are fewer books printed than there are in this one sort of pivotal year. And these are not great books. These are paranoid, amateurish. They're often called news books. And what they're meant to be is sort of a totalizing narrative telling you what is happening in England in this very frightening and very confusing moment. And so I would want to add to your definition of conspiracy theories. You offer this idea that there is someone who is doing us wrong. They have a clear identity. They have a motivation to harm us, and they have the capacity to do so. And for many of the conspiracy theorists, that was Charles and the Catholics. So rather than targeting the Jews, the conspiracy theories here target Catholics as the minority population in England at the time. What's amazing about this is we also see aspects of conspiracy theory that we see to the present day. So the first is this notion of a comprehensive or totalizing narrative. Conspiracy theories want to explain everything. And what they're trying to do is essentially say, reality as you know it is broken. It doesn't make sense. And because it doesn't make sense, I'm going to give you the hidden knowledge that shows you how it really makes sense. So conspiracy theories can't just explain alien landings. They have to make those connections. They have to be totalizing in one fashion or another. And what it leads to is a form of epistemic closure. What conspiracy theories end up doing is essentially saying, if I can find other media that supports this way of looking at the world, that becomes support for my point of view. Anybody else is part of the conspiracy. And that epistemic closure in which no outside information can challenge the assertions that you're making is one of the things that gives conspiracy theories so much power. So what happens in 1642 is this amazing convergence. It's a political moment where you have a very clear schism. You have Parliament versus the king. You have the insiders versus the outsiders, the Protestants versus the Catholics. And you have a media revolution that happens at the same time. And the media revolution here is the fact that there are these inexpensively published news books. They are unverifiable, right? And they start publishing what we would now think of as fake news. They assert that the king is dead. They assert that the king has fled to France. They assert that the king's leaders have left and defected in one fashion or another. And no one can verify any of this information because, of course, information can only travel at the speed of horseback at this sort of moment in time. So this is an enormously significant moment, this anti-Catholic conspiracy, which has some roots in reality. And this is another aspect of conspiracy theories. They generally are not built completely out of whole cloth. The fact that Jews might have survived at a higher rate than Christians during the Black Death ends up becoming something to hook this on. Charles is legitimately engaged in a renegotiation of the bargain with the Parliament, and there's a legitimate revolution going on, but this turns into the paranoia about Catholic infiltrators and Catholics overcoming England as we know it. But it hits this media moment simultaneously, and it's that convergence of new media and political tumult that I think is so interesting. And what I would end up saying in some ways is that this is an incredibly significant moment. In a very real way, fake news and conspiracy theories lead to the English Civil War, they lead to Oliver Cromwell, they lead to the slaughter of Catholics, they lead to a very dark moment in English history. They also lead to a really interesting intellectual moment, because what ultimately emerges out of the Great Fire of 1666, which burns a lot of these print houses and printing presses, but then ultimately is the establishment of the Royal Society. And the Royal Society's motto is nullus in verba, which you might think of as take no man's word for it. You cannot believe it just because you have read it. And this is a giant societal lesson that England finds itself sort of dealing with as these conspiracy theories have so much more power because they are presented in print. And so obviously in this conversation, I see a parallel to what's going on right now with the rise of participatory media and the internet, and what I'll talk about in a moment as the rise of sort of unreality. But I know that you see another moment around natural disaster and pandemic and misinformation within 1918. Tell us about that.
Well, so, we have what is now called the Spanish flu. And I think building directly from what Ethan's saying, and I'd like your thoughts on this as to why is it called the Spanish flu? You can say Spain was the only country willing to print information about a deadly flu that it was experiencing, right? So it was the flow of information that was allowed in that country as compared to other countries that gave it that label. Now in Madrid, they called it the Naples Soldier, right? Which was actually a popular song, a popular opera song at the time. And in Italy, it was the German disease. In Germany, it was the Russian plague. In Japan, it was the American disease. In Russia, it was the Chinese sickness, right? And in the US, really, what builds from this point of conspiracy theories hook into something real that's actually happening. And in fact, a lot of contemporary conspiracy theory scholars really try to make their audiences appreciate that conspiracies actually happen. There actually are groups of people plotting destructive things in the world. So, and a lot of us in the social sciences and in the academy are trying to make sense of social phenomena in very similar ways that people who are trying to make sense of confusing phenomena are trying to make sense of. They're just doing it a little differently with different types of information. I shouldn't say a little, a lot. But, one of the main stories that arose from the Spanish flu was that this was Germans dropping a new weapon of war. Mind you, this is 1918. We're talking right in the wake of World War I. And there were reports of them dropping the illness in boats. There was actually a woman who gave testimony of seeing a German boat leaving and a cloud of smoke and mist and fog that she swore was a biological agent. Others believed that it was being put into aspirin through the company Bayer, right? And this is building from the reality that we've just been at war with an enemy, right? And so we have a new biological problem. Oh, it must come from an enemy. Sound familiar with our current crisis with Wuhan and China? So there's this dilemma where you have political strife then something unexplained occurs, and it's a lot easier to fit into a particular narrative that is rooted in conflict, right? That has an identifiable agent that feels empowering. It allows us to make connections and feel like we actually have a little more control over a situation that is out of control.
So I think focusing on the Wuhan flu is a worthwhile way of sort of pivoting to our current topic, which is to say that we are pretty early in the stages of coping with a global pandemic. I think it's fair to say that the US has not done particularly well in coping with this pandemic, in part because political leadership felt like this was essentially a conspiracy. That in trying to shut down the US economy, you had activists on the left, this is what the president articulated, who were hoping to take away his victory, were hoping to take away the success of the economy that he had put forward. And this is an incredible shift, right? Because we're really not used to this idea that conspiracies are weapons of the powerful. Conspiracies are usually weapons of the weak. They're usually ways in which people say, oh my God, the world is inexplicable. Who are the powerful people who are controlling the world around us? But remember again, this theory of communicative shift and political shift. The communicative shift is the highly participatory shift of the internet. The political shift is the rise of something that I'm going to call unreality. And I would say the first hints that you get of unreality in the United States are in 2004, where you hear people in the George W. Bush administration talk about the reality-based community. And they sort of talk about this idea that there might be this sharp break between people who actually care about reality and then people who are willing to go along with political propaganda as it's put out on cable news, ways that the White House is spinning things. I see Donald Trump as sort of leaning into this in a way where you can start thinking of an approach to governing that basically forsakes the interpretation of a common set of facts in favor of creating closed universes of mutually reinforcing facts and interpretations. Which is to say, it's really hard to govern a complicated real world. It's much easier to govern a world where you assert what the facts are, how they should be understood, and if you pretend that that's the universe that exists, that ends up sort of clouding everybody else who says, wait a second, the world actually looks like this, not like this. I think the rise of conspiracy groups like QAnon are very much the direct result of this pair of shifts. And so what we're now starting to see around QAnon, around COVID-19, are these incredible, highly participatory conspiracy theories. Which is to say, there's no single text, there's no news book out there. There's lots and lots of people jointly making assertions and then people trying to sew this together into master narratives. And I want to sort of share what one of these narratives looks like. This is a map. Can we see this map? Jamie, are you getting that on your screen? This is a map produced by a designer who calls himself the Deep State Mapping Project. It's really just a guy named Dylan Lewis Monroe. He's a former fashion designer who has become a QAnon graphic designer. But he is starting to provide a lot of the visual language for what these conspiracy theories look like. And what you can see in this image is this idea that the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, with the cooperation of the WHO, the FDA, the CDC, the NIH, and AMA, ultimately through Bill Gates, creates COVID 5G, which is this idea that coronavirus is actually a direct product of 5G wireless technology, which he identifies as a novel bio-AI weapon. And then what you can see from here is on the left side of the screen, the good possible outcomes, the Great Awakening, which is what the QAnons ultimately hope, that we see that the American political system is riddled with satanic pedophiles and that we find a way to overcome this. The right side of it is what could happen to us: mail-in ballots, cheat to win, enslavement of humanity, and the Borg mind. So I want to recommend this image and sort of the language of this image to you because it tells us so much about how these theories are working. They are totalizing. They try to explain all of life and all of humanity, but they're a bricolage. They're an assemblage of all of these little pieces of things. And when you look at an image like this, you can find little pieces of it. Event 201, which turns out to be a military readiness test that has taken on significance with the QAnon movement, the Geneva Shiva cult. You can Google these things and you'll find information on them, and you'll feel like you're discovering and pulling your own narrative through this. So what the authors of the QAnon and later the COVID 5G conspiracy have done so well is they figured out who the enemy is today. And the enemy is elites. It's the three-letter groups. It's the WHO, the FDA. I'm sure it's also the FBI, it's the IMF, it's the UN. These are our Jews today, right? These are the groups that we are demonizing and fearing. It's expertise, it's professionalism, it's the people who actually have an orderly place in the state, and they're the ones who have become the secret oppressors. And within this, anyone can do their own research, as it's called, and discovery to figure out how we are being oppressed and sort of add to this larger picture. So it's a very different form of conspiracy. It's a fully participatory conspiracy. It's still totalizing. It's still this crippled, closed epistemology. But it's this attempt of a very ordered mind, perhaps to make too many connections and to use apophenia, this sort of art of making the unexpected connections, to connect things that are probably, unfortunately, random chance and happenstance.
Right. The scholars call this the naive deconstructionist, the idea that we're going to be able to make sense of everything, and that's what's really driving so much of our current conspiracies is really the fear and anxiety. And we feel a lot of fear and anxiety. I was telling Ethan when he was talking about that image that I wanted to share another image to show, just so when we move towards what we can do about it, to understand the similarities between people who are promoting these totalizing narratives that create an evil agent, and perhaps us that have political commitments of liberation that look different, but look very different. But in fact, there's more alike. So this is the Beehive Collective up in Vermont. And I remember they came to speak to me when I was in college and presented, this is what they call their narrative poster. And this is a poster, and each symbol, each animal, each symbolizes something in a narrative about free trade. And in this little corner up here, it's in Spanish, it says, "To those who want to dominate the world contests you, resistance," right? And we're seeing in the streets resistance, right? It's not the same in the same vein as these really magnificent, I don't even know what to call them, what Ethan just showed us. But we have to appreciate our tendency to try to make sense of all sorts of horrible things that are going on around us, aware that there are people who are profiting off of our suffering, right? And making connections between all of these different actors soothes us. It makes us feel empowered. It makes us feel like we know something, and that we can sit with that knowledge and deal, right, with our own anxiety, I think, for a lot of us. And so in the last 10 minutes before we move to Q&A, I want to take that as a starting point to think about, what do we do about conspiracy theories related to this pandemic? So I'm assuming many of the people on this webinar have followed that. That's why they're interested, right? And so I think, Ethan mentioned in that display shows some of them, but some of the more prominent ones, right, are Bill Gates is designing this. We've moved on from George Soros. This is Bill Gates. He actually really just wants to vaccinate us. They want to vaccinate us because they want to implant chips into us so that they can monitor us. They want the economy to collapse. The they, I'm not sure. I think I'm included because I'm of the masses who don't buy the conspiracy theories. But they, us, want the economy to collapse so that socialists can take over. There's some type of connection between this virus and 5G wireless connectivity, right? This is really the pharmaceutical industry looking for another opportunity to make money. And on, right? And so these, one of the things that I've, tried to do in my research is to sit with people who hold beliefs that I think are going to kill people. So I've done this in a variety of areas. I've done this teaching sexual health to people in places that don't believe in contraception and protection, and sort of sat and said, I understand that, and that will lead to AIDS, right? But I've done that also listening to people who are of particular national origin talk about people who are in another national origin. And I've sat and I've listened to it to really try to grapple with their worldview, because that's really helpful to understand why violence occurs and what types of meaning-making practices we might engage in to prevent it from happening in the future. It's really hard to sit and listen to people right now, I think for many of us, with these stories that are emerging in light of COVID. But what we know about conspiracy theorists is that if you provide a piece of information that is threatening, you are immediately, as Ethan said, in the conspirator camp, right? And so in order to make any type of entree, there needs to be some type of identification with the person, and this is in any conflict resolution model, where they feel safe, whatever that word means. And one thing we have to appreciate is that for people who are caught in these narratives, this is existential for them. And this is very similar, again, to what we see where you see genocides and other types of atrocities that I've studied. They feel their existence is threatened by this evil other, okay? And, even if we think that's delusional, that's real for them. And so how do we start conversations with people like that? Ethan, I have some ideas. I'm gonna ask you, what do you think? Having engaged with a lot of people who circulate virulent conspiracy theories in social media.
So the first thing that I would say is I think the point you made with that beehive collective narrative is invaluable, which is to say that the person who is making this paranoid map that I show you, and I'm going to use the term the paranoid map as a tip of the hat to Richard Hofstadter's the paranoid style in American politics, which is an essay from 1964 that frankly talks about almost everything we're talking about now, only 50 years ago. But I think understanding that people who are anti-vaxxers, who are very much some of the people who are most resistant to the health information around COVID-19, they are very much being incorporated into this COVID-19 5G narrative. They are also being incorporated into this QAnon deep state, this is all being done to combat Trump narrative. But the people who are sharing this sort of imagery see it as liberatory, and they see it as helping liberate people from a web of lies and a web of misinformation. And what I found is if you can try to find common ground around this idea of motivation, conspiracy theories are all about motivation. They take events that are often undisputed, but then they put different motivations behind them. So the idea that the virus emerges in Wuhan becomes significant because the motivation is the Chinese lab supported by the WHO, supported by Bill Gates, has weaponized it and sent it out. And so conspiracies are ways of collecting often facts that we agree on with different motivations behind it. If you can find a way to step in and say, yeah, I'm also really concerned about pharmaceutical companies. I'm really concerned about the idea that someone might try to make an enormous amount of money off of this. That then starts becoming some of the possible common ground on which you can actually have a conversation with someone who has found themselves within some sort of a closed epistemology. All that said, though, I think one of the other things that's going on at this moment is a realization that some ideas may be really dangerous. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me is how some of the large internet platforms have reacted to this plandemic video. So this was also featured on our map. This is also sort of one of the details within this. There is a discredited scientist who named Judy Mikovits, who has been interviewed in sort of a 26-minute film that's been released under the header Plandemic. And Mikovits theorizes that COVID has been synthesized within a lab, but that the only way that you actually get it is if you make the terrible mistake of wearing a mask, which activates COVID in your own body. And this is all a pharmaceutical conspiracy brought forward by Anthony Fauci. And what's interesting about this is Facebook, YouTube, and Google have decided they're just going to stamp this one out. If you search for plandemic on Google, it's extremely hard to find. It's been buried under many, many layers of information essentially trying to counter this video. And this is quite unusual. Generally speaking, where these platforms have gone is trying to be very open to all types of speech. They're very reluctant to be accused of censoring or accused of controlling speech. But now we have this moment of literal public health around COVID-19 where the platforms seem to be willing to say some of these ideas are so dangerous to our intellectual public health that we actually have to step down and try to sort of stamp them out. And so, Jamie, I find myself really torn about this because one of the things that I worry about is that I think the more that we suppress information, in many cases, the more appealing and interesting it gets to be towards conspiracy theorists. I think in a whole lot of cases, the idea of information they don't want you to see or don't want you to know is really catnip for this particular form of overly ordered mind. And so I'm sort of interested, should we respond to this just by sort of engaging one-on-one in the way that you're talking about, or should we be looking at the media piece of this and essentially saying, look, there's certain ideas that are so dangerous during a pandemic that we might actually have to control the speech environment so we don't have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area of research, I think, that I suspect people in communications know about in terms of controlling the censorship. I do know, you know, from international criminal law and cases around hate speech is that this has been criminalized, Goebbels and the cases out of Rwanda, because there was such a clear link between the use of radio to foment violence and the atrocities. And so, you know, the legal community has taken a pretty hard line on culpability for acts, not very, you know, you can say a lot of things in this country, but inciting violence becomes a particular line. What happens when what we're talking about isn't necessarily inciting violence, but is leading to behaviors that lead to deaths, right? I mean, we see this, and I think public health is a really difficult arena because of the dilemma of expertise. And I think it's also a dilemma because, like I keep pointing to, conspiracy theorists are hooking into something real. And so the pharmaceutical industry is profiting and the insurance industry is profiting, right? And so there's, you know, there are real critiques to make about the industries that are benefiting from human suffering. And so how do we come to people? And I get, you know, I think they're, you know, I'd be curious in the chat, other people talking about policy responses. For me, this is a very personal story of discussing with people who I think have worldviews that can really lead to some positive social change, but have been hooked by this type of inflammatory rhetoric because of their emotional needs. I think because it soothes their anxiety and it makes them, again, feel like they have more control over the world than they do. And starting with those shared values, and really is a nice opening, and pushing back ever so gently, pushing back against those belief systems, but in ways that do not do the "you are delusional." And that is really difficult when you're getting delusional information from people or seeing delusional information. I am struck right now by, we all have different people around us with different predilections, people who lean towards different types of information. And I'm seeing from the, I am going to, promote this as strongly as possible and make my identity on it, to, hey guys, what do you think about, this picture of an empty hospital room and the made up numbers of COVID deaths? And I think it's this, and that's coming from, I think, people who want to look like they're questioning authority and being critical thinkers. And so I think there's different approaches with those, extremes, right? The one that just is sort of trying to, make sense of the world in a sort of, more ignorant, I want to say, way, and others who are really, adamant, and you're not going to get to them. But what has struck me about those adamant people, and I've been, looking at discussing scientific research techniques and communication techniques, is what strikes me about those people in my life is they continue to ask for my opinion. Why do they care when my opinion continues to be, this is crazy? They continue to come and ask for the opinion. So there is an opening there of wanting approval. And I think that means there's an opening to push back. And I've seen when one says, that's not supported by so and this and this and this and this and this. I've seen some movement. And what the people, the writers, the people who really work on moving communication forward across differences have said about conspiracy theories is, don't let it sit. You really need to push back. People need to try to give them some dissonance from their bubble that is constantly feeding them. It's not a policy change, right? But I think it's a tool to sort of help deal with what a lot of people are dealing with. And like I keep saying, try to see that your desire to make sense of the world is not that dissimilar from their desire to make sense of the world. They're choosing to do so with information that is now readily available and that is speaking to something else that they need to get through a really hard time.
I just want to add one element to this, and then I'd really love to open up for questions. We've talked about this idea that when the world is scary, when it doesn't make sense, there is a tendency to try to create this totalizing narrative to put someone in control, because frankly, it's less scary to have someone in control than to have no one in control. And as we go through history, the powerful other who is undermining the social good is the Jews during the Black Death. It's the Catholics during the English Civil War. It's anybody who is not us during the Spanish flu. Right now, it's experts. And there's a reason that it's experts. My new book coming out this fall is called Mistrust. And it's all about how the rise of mistrust in institutions over the last 40 or 50 years has not only reshaped the political landscape, but it's not an accident. This has very much been a plan of certain socioeconomic forces trying to carve away at the role of the state, trying to carve away at the authority of these large institutions, and it's become an attack on anyone who would assert expertise. And you can think of this in many ways in terms of where we are in terms of governance. We have someone running the country who has no official formal qualifications to do so, and that becomes his qualification. The fact that he is non-expert and outside of those systems is the main reason for him to come in and do it. So absolutely, as we think about conspiracy and paranoia, we should think about all the different ways in which that play, but who that conspiracy focuses on, who becomes the persecuted group, that has a lot to do with what the shape of your society looks like at that particular moment in time. If it is a group that is wealthier, if it is a group that is more elite, and if it is a group that has been systemically demonized over some period of time, that's where the attacks are going to be. And what I think is going on for you, Jamie, when you're engaging with friends around this, they are willing to give you a pass. They're willing to see you as something other than an expert and to see you as a person for a short period of time. But that larger group of experts that you belong to, by virtue of being university faculty, by virtue of any sort of number of other things, that is the enemy. And so the desire to connect with you as someone who they're recognizing as a human, while seeing you potentially as a representative of that demonized class, I think that's part of what's going on.
Interesting. Let's get some questions.
Thank you, Jamie and Ethan. If you have questions, please write them to me in the chat. And in the meantime, I have a question to both of you. There is something very imaginative in these conspiracy theories. In a way, they are much more imaginative than, let's put it, usual people's ideas about the world. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. When does imagination become politically dangerous? When does, if someone writes a book about a future world or a dangerous world that is very imaginative, maybe this will not be a conspiracy theory. When does it become a conspiracy theory? When does imagination crosses this border?
Jamie, do you want to go first on that?
Sure. I mean, this is what I'm speaking to. Imagination is emancipatory.
Mm-hmm.
It is an opportunity to say this isn't working and this isn't working. People are in the streets saying this isn't working. And so I do think that this is the struggle for those of us that are interested in, different collectivities making sense of problems and attributing them to particular actors and, attributing malevolent intent to those particular actors. I think that, we need to balance our fear of conspiracy theories with our curiosity about where they're coming from. I do think that, one of the problems I'm having at the moment, and this is where Ethan's work fits in, is getting onto the same page about what are facts. And I do think that that is a difference right now at this moment between different camps that are pointing to social problems that they want to change and attributing malignant, intent. I do think that we're in a really big crisis right now about how do we provide information that people who disagree with us think is not just right, but tolerable, worthy of ingesting and thinking about. Ethan, this is your area. How, this is what I'm really, where do we go?
So look, let me tell a short story about creativity and paranoia. In August of last year, a meme went around on Twitter called 5 Jobs I've Had. And for most people who participated in this was a way for sort of politicians to show their faux humble roots, right? Everybody mowed lawns and sort of bagged groceries. So James Comey, so former FBI director who gets fired by Trump, who's thinking about running for president, he goes ahead and tweets out 5 jobs I've had: grocery store clerk, vocal soloist for church weddings, chemist, strike replacement high school teacher, and FBI director interrupted. And the QAnon community seizes on this tweet and realizes that 5 jobs I had, if you delete a few words, becomes 5 jihad. And then if you read down grocery store, vocal soloist, chemist, strike replacement FBI director, it is GVCSF. And they Google GVCSF and discover that it's the Grass Valley Charter School Foundation, which is holding a fundraiser. And then they start contacting the school because obviously this is where the next major attack of the deep state is going to occur. And ultimately, this charter school in Nevada has to call off their annual fundraiser because they are really worried about armed QAnons showing up to protect the innocent people there. So that line between creativity and dangerous is a very, very fuzzy line. QAnon is really remarkable in as much as there's no, the core text is so thin. It's actually worth going and reading these drops that come in from Q Clearance Patriot. They're all on a site called QMAP, and you can go and sort of look at them, but it's really difficult. It's like reading the book of Revelation. It demands enormous amounts of interpretation. And the fun of the game for people who are involved with QAnon is exactly that. It's doing the exegesis. So these are incredibly creative, incredibly thoughtful people. Jamie, I think you're absolutely right on the motivations. I think there's actually enormous alignment around this idea that systems are not working, something is enormously broken here, and therefore we need to decode it and figure out what's going on. Where QAnon and I go in different directions is that I don't think Donald Trump has been delivered to us by God to arrest Hillary Clinton and chase the pedophiles out of government. I don't think that that's what's going on. But we probably could agree on this idea that whether it's Obama, whether it's Bush, whether it's Trump, this system isn't working for most people. And that is the deep motivation that at the end of the day starts moving people towards the conspiracy space.
Yeah. You're muted, Alon.
Thank you. We have by now several questions, so maybe we can be shorter in our answers, and I will also try to bring some questions together. So Ryan Lee is asking, to what extent do you believe companies' response to conspiracy theories are motivated by reputation or public relations concerns?
By responses, I assume you mean media or social media. That's Ethan.
So, I mean, the interesting thing is that social media is thriving on some of these theories. QAnon exists entirely within YouTube in particular, some other spaces as well, but profoundly on YouTube. Some platforms have chased off QAnon. They decided that they're too dangerous, they're too disruptive. Reddit ended up sort of throwing them off. But it's this funny thing, when people want to participate in making media and paying attention to each other's media, it's enormously advantageous to the platform companies. And the platform companies are also very reluctant to pick fights with organized groups of people. So what I would say right now is the question is someone going to insist that these narratives are so dangerous that they have to get taken down? That's why Plandemic and watching these platforms make this conscious decision to take down something that was enormously popular, that's why that's very unusual. And we actually have to watch very closely, are they going to continue going in that direction?
We have a question from a journalist from Turkey, Gulsin Herman, who asks how journalists should cover conspiracy theories communities, the totalizing narratives while avoiding the risk of amplification. And there are a few other questions about how to talk about it in the media without giving it credence.
I think you can take this one, Jamie.
What a great question. You know, I think, again, when we look back on the concerns about the media in perpetuating hate speech and dangerous ideas is, I think that, you know, when we see the way the media covered Plandemic, when the way the media is covering anti-vaxxers, we're a little stuck because the groups of people that we may want to connect with so that they change their worldview are rejecting really anything that is coming from particular media or that threatens their identities, as I keep saying, right? It's existential for them. So I think journalists should not be thinking about those people and should be thinking about, like, the person I said who is trying to be open-minded and said, hey, what do you think of this? Do you have any, those are the audience people I think that, responsible media might be aiming towards, to point to these ideas and understanding where they're coming from and analyzing them the same way that I might, to go, how are people making sense of the world? we all risk, repeating, dangerous narratives, but I think helping make sense of these stories is a good way to get people who might be open to the fact that they really are just stories, to see that that's what they are, rather than that there's something more to it. That would be my response.
There are some people who are not going to be able to be reached, and that's the whole point of epistemic closure. They're going to find a way to decide that your motivations are such that they can't be reached. I think the question about how seriously to take this, how much to amplify this, is really smart. It's been interesting to watch the media cover QAnon. They've covered it mostly as something to laugh at. And then The Atlantic dedicated, really their last issue to it. They did a whole package of stories on why this is something worth taking seriously and how it actually has implications for politics going forward. I think in many ways, what people actually have done with Plandemic on the platforms is probably not a bad response, which is there's been this whole wave of debunking. And I think that's actually a valuable way to sort of announce that something is out there, but also very quickly say it's out there, be careful about how seriously you take it.
We had a question from David Mednikov, who asks whether you can link, or what are the links between what you discussed and the conspiracy theories that you, for example, Ethan, showed us, and right-wing politics in the United States?
So I think unfortunately the connections are just all too real, and they're actually very easy to find. President Trump has had a war on experts. You can see it most clearly in demonizing the media, which is an expert class of one fashion or another. You can also see it in this embrace of talk about the deep state. And those are very much elements of the QAnon conspiracy. The QAnon conspiracy believes that a deep state controlled by a cabal of elites is evil in all sorts of inhuman ways, and that's who Trump is fighting against. And that the only parts of the government that are not controlled by the deep state are the military, which is why Trump surrounds himself with generals. So I think in a very real sense, there is some alignment between the Trump campaign and a group like QAnon. I do not think that Donald Trump is a QAnon. I don't think he necessarily believes that he has been chosen by God to be the successor to President Kennedy to eliminate the pedophiles from Washington. I do think he's a profound narcissist who will happily listen to anyone who tells him about his own importance. And some of the people telling him that are people who have bought into this conspiracy. So I think this strategy, this anti-elite, anti-expertise strategy, aligns very neatly with what's going on with US politics, and has this tendency to make people involved with the specific conspiracy theory fellow travelers along with the president and increasingly the Republican Party.
I think we could also all point to discriminatory practices that have become part and parcel of the platform of some Republican Party leaders to strengthen their base, and we've now already discussed how tempting it is to blame others for the problems that we have in our societies. So that's also, I think, a big part of this as well. Immigrants, I mean, what has struck me about people who used to question, say, just the pharmaceutical industry, is how falling into circles that are talking about the powers that be have now become also xenophobic where they weren't before. And that, I think, is a shift that has happened because becoming xenophobic became a way to consolidate power, right? And that now feeds into additional narratives about immigrant groups and other racial minorities.
We have a question, the following. When I was younger, I believed the national security apparatus was seeking to disrupt leftist politics. That turned out to be true. Now, Republicans believe that the same national security apparatus seeks to disrupt the Trump campaign. How does one effectively say, yeah, they used to be conspirators, but now they are forces of justice?
That's my point. I mean, that's what anyone who studies conspiracy theories points to, is that we have to admit that there are real examples of things that were once called conspiracy theories turning out to be true. How do we fight that fact? We try to look at flaws in logic. We try to point to information, where people are getting their information from. But as I said, a starting point is, again, to acknowledge that they're hooking onto something. It's not delusional schizophrenic thinking necessarily, although some studies suggest that people who lean towards conspiracies do lean towards that way of thinking. Ethan?
The line between conspiracy theory and investigative journalism is blurrier than we would like it to be. Certainly when the Washington Post started writing about the Watergate break-in, it sounded a lot like a conspiracy theory. It turned out to be a really crazy moment in time. That's very much how the participants in QAnon see themselves. They see themselves as independent journalists, independent researchers. Those are the terms that they end up using. And perhaps they'll end up being right about some of these things. I don't think they're right about cheese pizza being code for child pornography and Hillary Clinton being a pedophile. But there may be aspects of all of this that we end up looking at some point and saying, no, that actually was something that had to get drawn out there. Where I think the demonization of the media is so dangerous is that the difference between conspiracy theory and investigative journalism is practice, having values and standards of practice, having a way of vetting and evaluating sources, having a way of documenting the work, which conspiracy theorists are not doing. And I think this is one of those cases where insisting on expertise and insisting on some aspects of an institution remaining important turns out to be very valuable.
So Saul Tenenbaum is asking, is there a good metric to understand what sort of traction conspiracy theories is getting? I would add, is getting these days in America.
Thrilled that you're here, Saul. Saul is a frequent guest and member of the Center for Civic Media community over at MIT. So I'm thrilled that MIT and UMass are starting to cross over. I think one of the ways to sort of understand the scale and scope of these things is to look for how many people are sharing and how many people are watching. And this is where I think YouTube is perhaps the most understudied and most important medium today. It turns out that there are thousands of QAnon videos, many of which have hundreds of thousands of views, and that suggests a very large population of people sort of taking this seriously. YouTube is much harder to study in many ways than something like Twitter. And so I think in many cases, we don't see phenomena until they erupt into the news sphere, right? It's not enough for them to erupt in physical reality. You need CNN to start covering people holding Q signs up at rallies for us to see it. And then we have to go and sort of figure out where people actually live and figure out how pervasive they actually are. Given that many of the technologies that are being used here are either so common and widespread that we don't study them well, like YouTube, or pretty esoteric, like some of the message boards that people are hanging out on, I think right now we actually don't have a very good sense for the size of QAnon. I think one of the best tests of this may be what happens when we have a coronavirus vaccine? What % of people refuse to take it? That's not going to be a measure of QAnon. It's going to be a measure of the anti-vax conspiracy. But there's definitely a lot of overlap between those spaces. And it's going to give us a sense of the magnitude of one of those very large, paranoid, closed epistemology communities.
Okay. I want to propose a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump is losing the elections on November 3rd. And millions of Americans believe that the elections were rigged. And he refuses to leave the White House. Just a thought.
That seems certainly plausible at the moment.
Ethan and Jamie, it was a wonderful discussion. It gave us a lot of food for thought, imaginative food for thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having us. This was just a pleasure. And Jamie, thank you so much.
We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Everyone, thanks for being with us.